It is my pleasure at this time to introduce our keynote speaker, Aaron Clay. Aaron is a longtime resident of the Western Slope of Colorado. After graduating from Hotchkiss High School, he received a bachelor and law degrees at the University of Colorado, and then came back to settle in Delta, where he established his law practice. He is an active member of the Delta United Methodist Church and was a water referee for the Colorado Water Court Division 4 from 1982 to 2008. He also developed and taught a class called Water Law in a Nutshell, and he's going to be sharing a portion of that with us today. This class has been accredited by the Western State Colorado University for 3 units of college credit, and he continues for continuing education by the Colorado Division of Real Estate and the Colorado Supreme Court. Welcome, Aaron.
Good morning. Nice to see you all here. So I'm going to have 2 talks today. The first one is an hour-long presentation about basic water law. And we're going to teach you a little bit about how water law works in Colorado and Utah. And then this afternoon, we're going to switch gears completely. We're going to talk about water equity. So this morning is kind of a lecture class. This afternoon, we're going to have a little more discussion. But this is an hour class of an 8-hour water law in a nutshell class that I put on. So we're going to move along really fast. Why do we need to have, sometimes when people ask, I'm now retired as a lawyer, but sometimes people would say, what did you do when you were a lawyer? And they would expect to say, you know, I was a criminal defense lawyer or whatever. And I would say, well, one of my specialties was water law. And I always get that double take look like, why do we need water law? What's water law? What is the big deal about that? Well, the big deal is that when there's plenty of water to go around, there's no problem. We don't need water law. But in times of shortage, when there's not enough water for all the people who are asking to use it, then we have to have some way to divide that up. We have to have some legal mechanism to decide who gets water and who doesn't when there's not enough water to go around. Those of us who live in eastern Utah and western Colorado can really relate to this because every year there's not enough water to go around in those areas. We live in a high desert, very little rainfall, we rely on the snow melt in the high mountains. And if there's not enough snow or it doesn't run out at the right times, we suffer. And so we can all relate to the fact that there's not enough water to go around. When the folks that settled Utah and Colorado were deciding how to set up their society, and in both cases by a constitution that talks about how their government was going to be organized and how they were going to run their society. Constitutional conventions, there were a lot of debates going on about lots of things, you know, what kind of how many senators do we want, how many representatives, all those kinds of things. One of the debates in both Utah and Colorado as a constitutional convention were going on was, what kind of a water law do we want to have? What kind of a system do we want to have for dividing the water among all the competing users? Because they had already experienced several years of drought before their constitutional conventions. They knew that they had to do something. They had basically 3 choices of ways to divide the water. There is a system called the Acacia system. There's a system of water law called the riparian system. And there's a third system called the prior appropriation system. For lots of reasons, they chose the prior appropriation system. The Acacia system is an interesting one. It's used in some small areas, mostly in New Mexico and in very southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley, where the Spanish influence was, where the conquistadors came in and the friars, and they established Santa Fe and some other settlements. And in that society, they use a system that is based on a little bit of need and a little bit of equity. And so we're going to talk a little bit about equity today, early. Because in the Acacia system, they have a person that's in charge of the ditch called the mayordomo. And the mayordomo's job is to divide the water among all the users on that ditch. But he doesn't divide it equally. He doesn't divide it based on the number of acres that they're irrigating. He does it based on need. And so if you have a user on a particular acacia ditch that is a widow with 6 kids and she's subsisting on whatever vegetables she can grow in her garden, that's a higher need maybe than someone who's richer and is just growing cattle feed, for example. So in an acacia system, you look at the need of every user and you allocate the water according to that need. In a riparian system, it is based on land ownership. Most of the riparian states are east of the 100th meridian, meaning east of Colorado. And if you've been back there, you know that it rains a lot east of Colorado. They lose dry land farming. They don't have to irrigate. And in most of those places, they have big rivers, and their water problem is not lack of water, but too much water. And they're building levees and they're trying to dry up land so they can farm it. And in those areas, they use a riparian water law because once in a while they do have a drought. And when they have a drought and the river's not enough to satisfy all the needs, they have to allocate it somehow. And in those states, it's allocated by land ownership. So if you own a big parcel of land, you get more water. Well, that didn't seem to be, neither of those systems seem to be applicable for Western Colorado, Eastern Utah, because the topography here is different. In the east, where they have big rivers, the farm is right next to the river, and so the water can be easily gotten to the field. In the west, the river is usually down in the bottom of a narrow canyon or a gorge, and the land that you're trying to irrigate is up on the benches up above, and you have to run long ditches to get it up away from the river before it's useful. And so we chose a doctrine in both Utah and Colorado called the Prior Appropriation Doctrine. It's also called the Colorado Doctrine because the Colorado Supreme Court began developing this in the 1860s before Colorado was ever a state, and continues to develop most of the law around the Colorado or Prior Appropriation Doctrine is the Colorado Supreme Court. So it's also called the Colorado Doctrine. The words prior and appropriation are terms of art. The word prior comes from the concept of first in time, first in right. Where do we get that concept that the first one there should be the one to take most water? Well, it turns out that that's a concept that's over 2,000 years old. It was called in Roman times the right of capture. And what they did with the Roman government, in order to encourage their soldiers to be brave and to go in and to conquer villages, like when they were trying to expand their territory and go into England or France or take out the Visigoths or whatever they were doing, they had a rule that the first soldier into a village, when they took over the village, got to take as much booty as he could carry and his slave could carry. That was a way to encourage them to go in and fight, because first in time, in other words, first one into the village, got the first right to choose the best stuff and load their slave down with it and then leave the village. That later became known as the right of capture. And the right of capture continued through England as after the Romans left. They left that law behind as part of the English common law, which got imported to America. And the right of capture is still a very valid right in the United States today. I'll give you 2 examples. If you have a parcel of land and there's oil underneath your land, you have the right to pump that oil out until it's gone. That's the right of capture. You're the first one there, you can pump it out. If you're, and this is topical now because hunting season has started, if you're a hunter and you go shoot a deer, you've captured that deer and that deer belongs to you. Until the moment you shot it, it belonged to the public. It was a public resource. When you shot it under the right of capture rule, you now have the right to take that deer home and eat it. So we understood the right of capture in the 1840s, 1849, 1850. We also understood mining law because mining law was based on the right of capture. That's why when they discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California in 1849, 100,000 men left the East United States, St. Louis and East, and went to California to try to strike it rich. And they were in a hurry because the law of capture was applicable to the mining law of the United States. Only the first person to find that gold vein got to take any of the gold out of that vein. And so you had to get there first, and you had to be diligent and really looking and find that gold. Well, what happened in Northern California when they found the gold was they had very similar water conditions to what we have in Eastern Utah, Western Colorado. there's not enough water in Northern California to satisfy all the people that were there looking for gold. They developed the prior appropriation system for water law in Northern California based on the mining law. First in time, first in right. If you're the first one to get the gold, you got all the gold. If you're the first one to start taking the water from the stream, you got all of the water if that's how much you needed to do what you wanted to do. Fast forward 10 years, in 1858, gold was discovered in Colorado. Now you can find 3 or 4 different chambers of commerce in Colorado that will tell you they're where the gold strike started in Colorado. Idaho Springs has a big sign on I-70 saying this is where the gold rush started. Not true. The gold rush on Colorado actually started at the intersection of Cherry Creek and the South Platte River in Denver. But Denver doesn't make that claim. Some of the mountain villages make that claim. They discovered gold. Someone found some flakes of gold at that intersection and realized that they had a gold mine on their hand, no pun intended. And so they began then to go up in the mountains and look for where did this gold come from? And that's how the gold rush started in Colorado in 1858. By 1859, about 95,000 of the 100,000 men that had gone to California came back to Colorado because the other 5,000 were able to make a living out there. Those 95,000 didn't find it because it was first in time, first in right. They got there too late. They couldn't find the gold. Then they thought, well, we'll go to Colorado and do the same thing. So that's how Colorado began to be developed in 1859, was the prospectors going all over the hills looking for gold. By the way, between 1859 and 1881, there were lots of conflicts, as you can imagine, between those prospectors out there and the Ute Indians, who actually had settled that area, owned it under their rules. And in 1881 was when the United States government finally moved the Utes out into their reservations that they have now. And I'll come back to that. That date's important because the Ute Indians, as all Native Americans have, still have water rights. And under the first in time, first in right doctrine, they were here first. And so their water rights are senior to everybody else's. So 1859, Colorado had some choices to make. We were headed to being statehood in 1876. And we chose in an early case called the Coffin versus Left Hand Ditch Company, we chose as a society to enact the prior appropriation doctrine because we understood mining law. We knew that they'd use it in California with some success. And so we chose in Colorado to use the prior appropriation doctrine. What does appropriation mean? Appropriation means taking. So if your 3-year-old appropriates a toy from somebody else's 3-year-old, they went over and grabbed it and took it, right? Appropriation and prior appropriation means the same thing. It means you have to take the water from the stream and begin to use it somewhere else in order to get a water right. One of the limitations of the prior appropriation system is that we did not make any provision for the stream itself. When it was being developed, because you had to appropriate it and move it from the stream, you could not get a water right leaving the water in the stream for any purpose at all. In Colorado, that changed in 1972. So we had almost 100 years of law where the stream itself had no rights. You had to take all the water from the stream. In fact, there's a doctrine that if you want to, and we'll talk in a moment about what a call is, but if you want to call the stream, you have to almost dry up the stream. You have to have a really adequate head gate and you have to dry the stream up. That's why if you drive through Glenwood Canyon, where Shoshone Power Plant is, there's about 3 miles of dry riverbed in the Colorado River because the Shoshone Power Plant has to take all that water and put it through its penstocks. We didn't think about the river itself until about 1972 in Colorado. Utah's a little better. Utah has a piece of doctrine called the public trust doctrine that says that the river itself has to have some water in it for the fish and the bugs and the plants that are there. Colorado didn't get around to realizing that until 1972. So we're kind of behind the curve on the issue of the environmental needs for the water. In the prior appropriation system, every decision that's made has 2 overriding public principles, 2 things that we look at. And the first is that all users are entitled to the stream as it was when they found it. That gives certainty to the system that if you come to the stream and there's 15 people ahead of you, first in time, first in right, you're in place number 16, you're secure with that number 16. You don't have to worry about somebody up above moving or monkeying or doing something else or sliding another water right in. All users are entitled to the stream as they found it when they appropriated. You can rely on where you are on the system. That leads to the non-injury rule, which we'll talk about in a minute, for change cases. So when you change a water right, you can only do it if you don't injure anybody lower than you on the system, because they're entitled to the system as it was. And the second major principle is that for economic reasons, we want to maximize the beneficial use of water in our state. That's why water is used and reused. The rule is a one-use rule, and that is if you're a farmer and you irrigate your 40-acre pasture, you have to immediately return that tailwater, that wastewater, that return flow water to the stream, because then it goes down to the next farmer. They take it, they irrigate their pasture with it, then they have to put it back in the stream. And so a molecule of water that originates, let's say up in Grand County in Colorado and comes down the Colorado River may have been used 6 or 7 or 8 times by the time it gets to the state line at Utah. And then in Utah, it's used 3 or 4 more times before it gets to the state line in Arizona. And so that same water molecule really provides a lot of economic benefit being used over and over and over. That rule of maximizing beneficial use also has some other interesting twist to it. And that is that we have a real aversion in Colorado and Utah to wasting water. In the East, they waste water all the time because they have plenty of it. In fact, pumping it out and just putting it in sloughs is what they do to dry up the land. We don't do that in Colorado. We want water to be used beneficially for our economic purposes. Once again, up until 1972, leaving water in the stream was considered wasteful. Well, now we don't think so. We'd like to have some water in our stream so that the environment is protected, but that's only a fairly recent idea in Colorado. And another thing that the maximizing beneficial use idea says is that we assign, and the court does this, assigns a duty of water to every use, because we don't want you to use more water than you really need. And so if you're overusing your water, that means somebody else doesn't get to use that water. So we're going to limit you to the amount that you really need, and then the rest of it stays in the stream and the next person gets to take it for the amount they really need, and so on all the way down. That maximizing beneficial use is really important, because if we didn't have that, our economy would suffer. There would be inequities in water distribution. The first in time, first in right doctrine would say that whoever got there first gets to take all the water. Well, there's a limitation on that. You can only take the amount that we have assigned as your duty of water. Like you might be assigned 1 CFS to a 40-acre parcel, for example. You might be assigned 350 gallons per day to a single family residence. We think that's adequate. Turns out that that's way more than adequate. None of you in this room use anywhere near 350 gallons per person per day, or 350 gallons per household, but that's an old duty of water assignment. So that was the concept, is that we had to allocate this water. We're going to do first in time, first in right, and people understood that. And so they went to the stream, they appropriated water in the early days for mining, and a little later for agriculture, and even later for municipal use, and even later for environmental use. So as society changed and grew, we have new uses coming online. And we used first in time, first in right for all of those uses. Then we had some disputes. If you can imagine that humans had disputes over things. We had water users. You can imagine people fighting over water. We had water fights way back when. And we had to have a method to resolve those water fights. Different states chose different methods. In Utah, the method for assigning those water rights was given to the Utah State Engineer, now called the Department of Water Resources. And so to get a water right in Utah, you go to the state engineer's office and you show them your plan. You tell them where you're going to take the water, what the duty of water is, when you plan to use it, all those issues. And the state engineer's office issues a permit for the taking of that water, which then goes to a court process. But the court essentially is just making sure that the state engineer went through the proper process. not really a trial. It's more of an administrative process. In Colorado, we chose to do a judicial process. So way back in the 1860s, we started having what was called adjudications, special court process. It wasn't I'm suing you, it wasn't the state suing you. It was a big operation or a big court case where they sent notice up and down the creek, and they put a notice in the newspaper and the post office and the cafe and wherever else they could find people. This was way before you could put it on Facebook, but they found people and they said, if you claim a water right on Clear Creek, for example, Clear Creek in eastern Colorado, happens to be in Jefferson County. The Jefferson County courthouse is in Golden. So they said, if you have a water right, you claim a water right in Clear Creek, you need to file your claim in the Golden County courthouse by a certain date. You had to have a map, you had to have a statement of claim, you had to have some testimony to prove your claim. And it was first in time, first in right. They probably had in that first adjudications, 100, maybe 200 different applications for different water rights all up and down the stream. And at the end of a process, after a referee went out and looked at all the water rights, and the judge might have had some hearings and they had cross-examination, just like any other court trial. At the end of that process, the court entered a decree, and then the water right became a decreed or adjudicated water right. And that decree had a listing of water rights from number 1 down to the last one, maybe number 200. And then we knew who was first in time and who was last in time, and how then to allocate those water rights on Clear Creek in our example, based on whoever got there first. That really provided a lot of certainty to the system, because you had a judicial stamp, you had a court stamp of approval on that list of water rights. The list of water rights is officially called a tabulation. Well, that was great. We have a court decree that says how we're going to allocate. That stopped all the fighting. No, it did not stop all the fighting. Then we had to have a method for who's going to enforce that court decree. Well, we had a couple of choices to make as a society. We as a society had a couple of choices to make. One choice was to have the judge be the enforcement mechanism. And in some states, they do that by court orders and contempt of court citations and all those kinds of things. The judge says, you will open this head gate on this date and close it on this date, and somebody does that. In Colorado, we chose not to use that system. We left the judges make the water rights determination and issue the decree for the tabulation. But then in Colorado, we turned that tabulation over to the executive branch, and this is the same in Utah. The state engineers in Utah and Colorado are in charge of that, of enforcing that decree. And the way they enforce it is they hire deputies that are called water commissioners. And in Colorado, we also have a middle level called division engineers. But the water commissioner is the person who is in charge of enforcing the court order. They're the cop on the water beat. In Colorado, in the early days, water commissioners were actually deputized deputy sheriffs of the county that they lived in, and they carried a pistol on their hip. About 1950, we decided that carrying that pistol was probably causing more problems than it was solving, and so they're no longer deputized, but they are special agents of the state in enforcing the water law. They have the right to go to the head gate that they need to monitor the measuring device and make sure that the proper amount of water is going in. They have all kinds of rights and privileges and duties to do in enforcing this tabulation. So that system works very well, and it's worked for 150 years in both Utah and Colorado. And the water commissioner is a very important part of that whole thing on how do we get water to the right people at the right time. Well, the other thing that happened in the 1880s and 1890s was that people discovered that Colorado and Utah were nice places to live. And as we all in this room would like to shut the door and not let anybody else come into Colorado and Utah, they couldn't do that in 1890 either. So people kept coming in, and they were still appropriating water because they were starting a new farm, or they were setting up a new business and they needed more water. And so then we had more disputes about the next batch of people who came in and said, well, I need some water now. So we had to have a second adjudication. Same process, send a bunch of notice out, get everybody in the courthouse and sort it out. And then we have the first adjudication tabulation with 200 water rights on it, and maybe the second adjudication tabulation with another 150 water rights. Wonderful, we have them all in order. to encourage people to come in and get their water right decreed. So we have certainty. Remember, everybody's entitled to the stream as they found it. So we have certainty of where you are in that system. There's a special rule between the first adjudication and the second adjudication. It's called the postponement doctrine. And what it says is that if you didn't bother to come into that first adjudication, you can still come into the second one and get your water right decreed, but you're going to be junior to everybody who bothered to come in, even though you might have a senior appropriation date. So that's an exception to the first in time, first in right rule. In the first adjudication, everybody's first in time, first in right. The first person gets priority number one. In the second adjudication, you might have somebody that just didn't get into that first adjudication, and for whatever reason, we're going to make them come down here, and they might be the first priority in that second adjudication, but they're essentially priority 201 in the overall scheme on that particular stream. See how that works? Postponement doctrine, really important because it made sure that everybody got into the adjudications. And so 30 years later, we thought we had certainty on that adjudication. 30 years later, somebody comes back and says, oh no, I have an 1860 date up here. They slid in here. Now, there's an exception to the postponement doctrine for federal water rights. So when you have a new federal water right come into the system, like a monument or a national park or Yellowstone or an Indian tribe, they're not under the postponement doctrine. And so when the Southern Utes have been litigating for about 60 years in the Colorado adjudication process, they finally got their case settled. They had a big settlement about 20 years ago, got their water rights decreed and allocated, and they slid in clear up here because their appropriation date is 1840. So they're the most senior water right on the rivers, the Animas and La Plata River that they use down in southeastern Colorado, southwestern Colorado. They're the most senior water rights. That is why we have a reservoir down there called Lake Nighthorse. That was a settlement between the federal government, the local water users, and the Ute Indian tribe that allocated a bunch of water to the Ute Indians out of Lake Nighthorse. And the federal government spent millions of dollars building that reservoir to make that settlement work. So that postponement doctrine is important, but also it's important that we recognize the equity of Native American water rights. The problem with the fact that we haven't recognized environmental needs until in Colorado 1972 is that the postponement doctrine does apply to environmental needs. So as of 1972, we have an agency in Colorado, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, that has begun to appropriate water rights for in-stream flow for fish and bugs and plants in a particular stretch of a creek. The problem is that they couldn't file those cases in water court until after 1972. And so by the time they got into court, the postponement doctrine applies, and they are very, very junior water rights in the grand scheme of things. And so we still have an issue with the prior appropriation system about how to get what we all agree now is more environmental needs for just leaving water in the river into the whole system, where in many cases the river is now already over appropriated, meaning there's more decrees than there is water to satisfy those decrees most times of the year. So we're still struggling with that issue of equity with the environment in the prior appropriation system. So how does the water commissioner work? Well, in Colorado, there's about 80 of them. They have a particular stream stretch that they're responsible for. They might have 300 or 400 ditches that they're responsible for administering. And how do they do that? They wait until they know that there's a need by a senior downstream water user. So you have a stream here, you have a downstream senior water right that's not being satisfied. They do something that's a term of art called calling the stream. Calling the stream is a term of art in the prior appropriation system. And what it means is I'm a downstream senior user and I'm not getting my full allocation of water into my head gate. I call the stream. On the old days, that meant actually finding a water commissioner and handing them a piece of paper. Find them in the restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever, and you hand them a call paper. Today, that means emailing the water commissioner and saying, I'm out today, I'm calling the stream. Then what happens is the water commissioner begins to administer the stream. And the first thing they do is they make sure that nobody's taking water that doesn't have a decree. Up until that point, until the call goes on the stream, you don't have to have a decree to take water out of the stream. It's a public resource. You have the right to appropriate it. When the call comes on, then if you don't have a decree, you're out. Your head gate gets shut off. That may produce enough water to the stream that the downstream calling water right is satisfied. If that's true, there's enough water and the downstream right is getting all that they're allocated, then the water commissioner's done for that day. If it doesn't do that, or if the stream continues to dry up, the call gets put back on, then the water commissioner goes up the stream and they shut people's head gates off in reverse order of priority. So the most junior head gate gets shut off first, and the next most junior second, and so on. And so maybe the water commissioner shuts off 5 or 6 head gates, and that water then stays in the stream and goes down to the calling water right at the bottom. At the point that the calling water right is satisfied, there's enough water to take for them for their allocation, then the call stops and we don't shut any more head gates off. A week later, there's less snow melt, there's less water in the creek, the call comes back on. The water commissioner goes back up and shuts off some more head gates, again in reverse order of priority. So the more senior your water right is, the more value it has, because you're more likely to be left on. A better way to say it is less likely to be called out. That's why you want the most senior water right on the stream, and why the more senior water rights are much more valuable than more junior water rights. That's the way the system works. So there is an interesting calling right on the Colorado River that there's several of them. In Colorado, there's 2 that I'm going to talk about. One is at Shoshone Power Plant. If you've driven through Glenwood Canyon, I-70, you see that dry stretch of river. That's because upriver, there's a dam all the way across the Colorado River. All that water is going through the side of the canyon, down in a tube, just cut into the rock wall, and it drops out into 2 pin stalks that come out of the side of the hill there through a power plant, the Shoshone Power Plant. That power plant has a 1907 priority, pretty senior on the system, for 1,250 CFS, a lot of water. That's called the calling water right for the upper Colorado River. So if the Shoshone Power Plant is not getting 1,250 CFS through its pin stalks, it does a call on the system, and anybody who's junior to 1907 up above that location is at risk. Well, who's junior to 1907? Transbasin diversions are junior to 1907, and transbasin diversions are critical in Colorado because 80% of the population of Colorado lives on the Front Range. 80% of the natural water is on the western slope. So we have to move that water from the west to the east to satisfy the demand along the Front Range. That's legal, done all the time, been doing it for 100 years, but all of those transbasin diversions, like Dillon Reservoir, are junior to the Shoshone Power Plant. So if Shoshone is on call, they're not storing any water in Dillon Reservoir. They're not storing any water in the big reservoirs up there, and that means Denver could be shortage of water. So that's a big calling water right to be aware of. The other calling right on the Colorado River Basin is right here. It's called the Cameo Call. If you go out of town up I-70 and you just get into the Beck Canyon, just as you get into the canyon, you see a huge dam all the way across the Colorado River. You see a huge canal going out to the west. That's called the Roller Dam, and it's just below Cameo, Colorado. So generically, that's called the Cameo Call, and it has a 1912 priority for 670 CFS. And so that's quite a bit of water. The Colorado River will run, today it's running about 700, it looked like to me when we came across. And so that also calls out, well, who's up above the Cameo Call on the Colorado River? Probably nobody we care about. Aspen, Vail, Steamboat Springs, Denver, Fort Collins. How can Fort Collins be above there? Because Fort Collins has a transbasin diversion out of Granby Reservoir through a tunnel into the Poudre River. And that's how Fort Collins gets most of its water, through that system. So The cameo calling right down here in the Grand Valley is a really important water right, and everybody upstream wants to make sure that the cameo call is satisfied during the irrigation season, otherwise they get called out. So you've been to court in an adjudication or in a water court process. You have a decree that tells you where your water right is, what its priority is, what it can be used for, how much it is. What does that mean? Well, in both Utah and Colorado, and by the way, that decree is going to look the same in Utah. The process to getting the decree is slightly different. It's a state engineer instead of an applicant-driven process, but the court still issues a decree. So that's your decree. What do you have? Well, you have a property right. And it's a property right like a car or a horse or a piece of real estate. It can be mortgaged. It can be leased. It can be transferred. It can be sold. And one more thing that's important to a water right and unique to a water right is that it can be changed without losing its priority. Think about the postponement doctrine. If every time you wanted to make a change to your water right, you came back to the court and said, I'm going to change the place of use, for example, or the type of use, and the court would adjudicate that, but then it gave you a new priority because of the postponement doctrine, water right wouldn't be worth very much. You'd be going from a senior water right to the most junior water right on the system. We don't want that to happen. And so there's a way to keep your priority when you want to make a change of water right. You want to change its use, maybe you're going to change its place or its point of diversion. And you can do that so long as you don't injure anyone else on the stream, because everybody else in that list of decreed water rights has a right to the stream as it was when you found it. So when you come into court and say, I want to change my water right, you have to show the court that there's going to be no injury to anyone else when you do that. And there's lots of ways to show that. We're not going to have time today. It's an hour-long discussion, so we're not going to do that today. But just know that their water rights can be changed. And that's really important because as we grow as a society, we're having to change water rights. As the urban areas of eastern Colorado grow, there's not enough water to satisfy those. And so they are buying up farms in eastern Colorado and changing the water rights from irrigation to municipal. Same thing is happening in the Wasatch Range. As those cities in Utah haven't grown very much, have they? Since the Olympics of 2000. I have driven in Salt Lake City recently, so I know as those cities have grown, they have to have new sources of water. And so they have to go buy a water right from a farmer or somebody has a senior water right and change that to municipal use. We allow that to happen, which is important so long as they don't injure anybody else on the stream. Really important property concept. So to avoid injury, you could talk to the court or in Utah, the state engineer about what we call terms and conditions. Okay, we're going to make this change, but we're going to limit the amount that we're going to let you take because there's always been some component of your use that was left in the stream and you have to still leave that amount in the stream. So we're going to let you take what's called the consumptive use away. You can change your water right, but you can only sell the consumptive use. The return flow has to go back because the next person is relying on that return flow. That's the one use rule, maximizing beneficial use. Or you might come up with an augmentation plan. So to make a change where you don't have any way to limit injury to someone else, you could come up with some other water from another source. Usually it's a reservoir somewhere and you lease or buy water from that reservoir and you just say, I'm going to replace the water that I'm taking out for this new municipal use at that location with this reservoir water. That's a really good way to maximize the beneficial use. You store the water in a high mountain reservoir in the springtime when there's water enough to go around. You hold it until August or September, and then you release it to satisfy this new use. That's basically called an augmentation plan or plan for augmentation. So that's how the system is able to be flexible and to adapt to changing times. And it also creates a value. So some farmer that has a senior water right has some real value just to the water right without the land, because they can sell that water right to a municipality that could change the use to municipal use, adds value to that farmer. And for many farmers, that's actually their retirement plan, is their water rights that they're holding on their farm. Someday that farm's probably going to be houses, and then they'll use the water rights that way. So far, I've been talking about surface water rights. I've been talking about head gates. Now we're going to switch a little bit to groundwater rights. Groundwater is a special category of water rights because you can't see it. Surface water is pretty easy to understand. The waters are in the stream. There's a head gate. I open the head gate, the water runs down the ditch. Pretty easy to see. Groundwater is a little different because groundwater moves differently depending on what kind of cobble and gravel and other stuff is underneath the ground. You can't see what's happening. You can take a guess at it, and hydrologists will really take good guesses at it. Many times they're 20% or 30% off on their guess. They tend to guess high for their client, and so lots of times we come back to court and say, you know, I thought there was this much water, but there's really not that much water. So groundwater is a different animal. And because of that, we have special rules, both in Utah and Colorado, for wells. In Colorado and Utah, you can simply apply to the state engineer, get a permit. In Colorado, you don't even have to do that. You just go, if you're in priority, you go open your head gate. But for wells, you have to have a permit from the state engineer. Both Utah and Colorado, state engineer issues well permits, and you have to a permit before you can drill a well. Colorado has a rule that if you go less than 10 feet, you've actually created a spring, not a well, and so we don't have to be subject to the water well rules. Utah had a rule that if you were less than 30 feet, you were also a spring, and so you weren't subject to the water well rules. Utah just changed that law 2 months ago, and so now any groundwater in Utah, any new groundwater appropriation, any new well has to have a well permit issued by the state engineer. When you apply to the state engineer to see if you can get a well permit, their criteria sounds like a lot like a change case, is lack of injury, because everybody on the stream is entitled to the stream as they found it when they appropriated. A new well is going to take water out of the stream that wasn't being taken when somebody else made their appropriation. And so we have you have to show lack of injury before you can get a well permit. Well, how do you show lack of injury? You might be lucky. You might be in a place like Durango, Colorado. There's never been a call on the Los Animas River in Durango, in the Animas River. So you can get a well permit in that basin because there's no injury. There's plenty of water, at least historically, to go around. That's not usual. Most of Colorado and all of eastern Utah is what we call over appropriated, meaning that there's more decrees than there is water at least a few days every year. And so in those cases, you have to have something else to show that state engineer that you're not going to injure. Most of the time, the way you show that is by developing another plan for augmentation. You go find a reservoir somewhere, you buy some shares, some water out of that reservoir, and you make sure that you can get the reservoir to the same reach of the stream that you're depleting the water by drilling your well. And then you just say, I'm going to take water out of my well and use it for this, but I'm going to replace that water from water that I'm releasing from this upstream reservoir. That's a typical plan for augmentation that allows the system to keep working and not violate the no injury rule for other people that are on the stream. In the water world, we have a special kind of corporation that you need to know about. It's called the Mutual Ditch Company. And it was done because when they first started developing water way back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were one or two farmers didn't have enough capital, enough money gathered together to dig the size of the ditch that they wanted. A good example of that in this valley is the Grand Valley Water Users Association. 1907, a bunch of people got together and said, look, if we could get water from the roller dam up into Beck Canyon, at the mouth of Beck Canyon, over to Loma, think about all of the fields that we could have out here. If any of you have driven from Fruita to Loma on the back roads, K Road, L Road, M Road, what do you see out there? You see hay after hay after hay, or corn or onions or beans or whatever they happen to be growing this year. That's only there because 115 years ago, a bunch of farmers got together, pooled their money, started digging that ditch. And it's called the Highline Canal, goes all the way to Loma. It's about 15 miles long. And they formed a company Grand Mesa Water Users Association, that's called a mutual ditch company. It's a special kind of corporation under Colorado law. It's a nonprofit corporation, but it's limited to its mission. It can't go into the business of environmental restoration or something else that a nonprofit might do. It can't operate a church like a nonprofit might do. It's a sole mission, mutual ditch company. Its job is to take water from the stream and deliver it to its members. Now, obviously, it has to have a bank account to be able to pay the ditch rider, and it has to, it's a corporation, but it can only do one thing. It delivers water to its members. Because of that, it has some special categories and some special privileges that other kinds of corporations don't have under Colorado and Utah law. And there are lots. I counted up when I was preparing for this. I just did a Google search for mutual ditch companies in the Wasatch Valley, and I came up with 12 of them that fast. So I know there's lots of mutual ditch companies that operate in Utah also, but in Colorado, they're everywhere. And they're important to know because when you are a farmer, you probably don't own the water right. You probably own a share of a mutual ditch company that actually owns the water right. And so the water right, like the Cameo call that we talked about, that 670 CFS, is owned by 2 or 3 mutual ditch companies, 3 to be exact. 3 mutual ditch companies own all that decree, and they have hundreds of members, maybe thousands of members, that then get their water delivered because they have a share of stock in that mutual ditch company. That share of stock gets them the right to vote for the board of directors every year at the annual meeting. It requires them to pay the assessment per share that's required to run the company. And it also entitles them to their proportionate amount of the water that's coming down the ditch. That's how you get water into a mutual ditch company. Having the decree system and having the water commissioner system solved most of the problems of water allocation until very recently. And what's happened recently, we're going to talk a little bit more about this afternoon, is the drought. And the drought has really stressed the system. And we're seeing some cracks that develop in the prior appropriation system now in the last 20 years that we didn't see before. We'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. But the other problem that wasn't resolved by the decrees is a private property issue. And it happens all the time. And generically, we call these neighbor problems. To get water from the stream to your property, you're probably crossing 15 or 20 or more neighbors, and they may be more or less neighborly. And the less neighborly they are, the more trouble you're going to have. And so in both Colorado and Utah, we have some special rules that ditches get to operate that no other kind of property right gets to use. And that rule is that every ditch has an easement that goes with the ditch. It's called an implied easement, meaning that just the fact that the ditch is there creates an easement. An easement is the right to use someone else's property without their permission. If we didn't have that, you can imagine the chaos of a water user who has to go through 15 different properties to get to the head gate. And every time he has to go across some neighbor, he has to negotiate with the neighbor some kind of a written document. That would be total chaos. It wouldn't work. And so Colorado, 150 years ago, created a rule, Colorado Supreme Court created a rule, that if you have a ditch that goes across your neighbor, you don't need their permission. You have an easement that goes with that. Well, as people move in, those properties change hands, new people come in, they figure this is my property. I don't want my neighbor going across my property, even though he's on the ditch bank to get to his head gate. Happens all the time that all of a sudden there's a new fence across the ditch, across the ditch bank road. Now you got a neighbor problem. We have to educate people about the Colorado law says he has the right to go across your property as long as he's just using it to access the ditch, operate his head gate. He has a right to do that. Lots and lots of neighbor problems like that. One of the problems is that this is called an implied easement. Implied means not recorded. It's just there because of the use of the ditch. It doesn't show up in the real estate records anywhere. And so when someone moves in here and they're being very cautious to make sure they know what they're buying, they get a title commitment from a title company. That title commitment doesn't say anything about ditch easements on this property. Next spring, they come along and there's somebody in their backyard with a backhoe digging the ditch. They go to the title company and say, wait a minute, you didn't tell me there was an easement there. And the title company says, read the fine print. And the fine print says, we do not assure against parties in possession not shown by the public records. That's a big word. Parties in possession not shown by the public records. Standard part of every title insurance policy. And a ditch owner is a party in possession of an applied easement that doesn't show in the public records because it's not recorded anywhere. And so the title company is not responsible. And now you're back to the neighbor fight over what is your right to use my property to dig your ditch. Lots and lots of litigation about that. And the flip side of that is that the ditch owner has a property right. And the what's called the servient estate, the underlying landowner cannot interfere with the ditch owner's property right. Like you can't drop a culvert in someone else's ditch without their permission. You certainly can't close off their ditch without their permission. You can't put a fence across their ditch. There's a property right there that you have to respect. That creates all kinds of private property conflicts. There's also another issue that's coming to the forefront that you're going to hear more and more about. And that is that in the prior appropriation system, which has been in effect now for about 160 years in Colorado, about 130 in Utah, we did not take into account that people might actually want to float up and down a river. Because it wasn't a big deal until about 30 years ago. The recreation industry in Colorado began about 30 years ago, the water recreation industry, when people discovered how much fun it was to climb in an inner tube or a rubber boat and go down the Colorado River. It's not an issue on the Colorado River because most of the Colorado River overflows state land or federal land. It is an issue on smaller streams where you have a farmer that has a pasture and there's a stream that runs through his pasture. And then you have someone in an inner tube or a raft or just a fisherman who wants to walk up and down or float up and down that stream as it goes across the farmer's field. You see a conflict coming there? Of course. The farmer says, this is my private property. I have the right to exclude people. That's one of the primary things that you have private property for is the right to exclude people. I have the right to fence my boundaries and keep my cows in. And the floater says, yeah, but that barbed wire fence is really not good for my rubber raft. And so now you have that conflict between the right to float the river or fish it and the right to exclude people. In some states, that conflict has been resolved. Utah, Wyoming, and Montana all have either statutory or part of their constitution that there is a public right of access in public waters. In Colorado, we have not reached that point yet. It's not in our constitution. There is no Colorado Supreme Court case. And in fact, this Colorado Supreme Court has said, if you want to create this right, you're going to have the legislature do it. About 20 years ago, there was an attempt by the legislature to create one small piece of the Taylor River up by Gunnison as a floatable river. It never made it out of committee. And so in Colorado, it's still up for debate and discussion about whether there's a right to float and a right to use the bed of the stream between the high water marks. In other states, not so much of an issue, but as the recreation industry becomes more and more prominent in Colorado, you're going to hear that discussion going on. And I'm out of time. I will see you at 12:30 this afternoon. We'll talk about water equity. Okay, you're welcome. Welcome back. Kayla and I skipped lunch with you guys because her nephew had surgery a couple days ago. They live in Fruita, so we went out to see how they were doing. He's doing fine. He had a broken bone from a swimming pool accident and had to put his leg back together, but he's going to be okay. So, and Gayla reminded me on the way back in from Fruita that you guys have all just eaten lunch and it's kind of warm in here. So if you need to nod off, it's totally understandable. It's not a problem. This second talk is entitled Water Equity. What do we mean when we use the term water equity? Well, first of all, equity implies that all people are treated the same and have the same access to basic necessities, regardless of their physical location or their economic status. We all know that water is a basic necessity of life. You can live about 3 days without water, and that's about all. And air, food, and shelter are the other basic necessities. So you would have equities in those areas too, but we're going to talk about the basic necessity of water. Water is also a necessity for all the other species of plant and animal life on the earth. So we need to remember that even though we're really talking about humans, when we talk today about equity, there's a whole nother set of animals and plants that God created that we need to do that. It is a basic necessity, but it's only useful if you use it. And so equity is not about not using water. Equity doesn't mean that you don't ever get to use water, because if you can't use it, it's not good for us. You have to have it. Equity is about using water wisely, not wasting it and not putting it in the wrong places for the wrong things. Using water wisely and fairly for the best of all, and all in my case includes plants and animals. The Commons is a entity or an organization that tries to promote good for everyone, and their newsletter is called On the Commons. And in the July 2022 issue, topically, it says, "We should affirm water as a commons. It belongs to everyone and to no one exclusively. It must be passed on to future generations in sufficient volume and quality." One of the things I didn't mention this morning when we were talking about the prior appropriation system is that there is no mention of water quality in the prior appropriation system. One of the problems with it is that you can pollute as much as you want. You may have a problem with the Clean Water Act, which is a federal statute, but you don't have a problem with the prior appropriation system. And riparian states are actually much better than prior appropriation states in monitoring and taking care of their water quality, partly because they have more water that they can deal with. But Colorado and Utah both have recognized water as a commons or as a necessity. Utah does not have it in its constitution, but there's a series of Utah Supreme Court decisions where they state over and over that this is a public resource. Water is a public resource. They did that in affirming the ability of the state to regulate how water is going to be doled out. Colorado in its constitution states the unappropriated water of the state belongs to the public. Uncertain words. The unappropriated water of the state belongs to the public. At the same time, both Colorado and Utah recognize that without water, there is no civilization and no economy and no people. So the public's resource must be used. The key is how to use it efficiently and equitably under the definition of equitable, all persons being treated the same. Many entities have recognized the fact that there's a lack of clean water around the world that affects millions of people. As long ago as July of 2010, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution recognizing, quote, "the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right that is essential for the full enjoyment of life and all human rights." Furthermore, since 2015, the General Assembly and its Human Rights Council have recognized both the right to safe drinking water and the right to sanitation as closely related but distinct human rights. Not going to get into the right to sanitation today, but that means that you have a place to dispose of waste in a safe and clean manner. So how are we doing in our society at creating water equity? Let's start on the local level, and then we'll move across the country, and then we'll expand out into other parts of the world. Locally, Eastern Utah, Western Colorado, generically what we call the Colorado River Basin, and the entire state of Utah actually are in a drought, which is in its 22nd year. Started in the year 2000, now we're in the 22nd year of this drought. This drought has caused the Great Salt Lake to shrink to its lowest level in recorded history. It has caused Lake Powell and Lake Mead, actually both reservoirs, to shrink to a point where they may not be able to generate electricity anymore. It has fallowed millions of acres of productive farmland, not just in Colorado and Utah, but in Southern California and Arizona. And it has caused major arguments among the 7 Colorado River Basin states. That's Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. We call the 4 upper basin states. And the 3 lower basin states are Nevada, California, and Arizona. We have lots of arguments. And the 14 Indian tribes that use the Colorado River and the federal government, because most of the land in the Colorado River Basin is still under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Most of it's BLM land, actually. And the federal government owns Lake Mead and Lake Powell and Flaming Gorge Reservoir, and most of the other large dams are all federal projects. So when you have a decision to be made about the Colorado River, you have 7 states at the table, you have 14 Indian tribes, although they were left away from the table until very recently, but now they are at the table, and you have the federal government. Ironically, sometimes the federal government fights against itself. You have the Bureau of Reclamation, which owns, we'll take Glen Canyon Dam, which forms Lake Powell, as an example. Glen Canyon Dam was built in the late 30s, early 40s, and it was to do flood control. It was also to help the 4 upper basin states meet their compact obligations to the lower basin states by serving as a savings account. And we have good years of rain and snow, we can trap it in Lake Powell and then release it when we don't have those good years. We've had 22 mostly bad years. There's been 2 good years in the last 22. Anyway, the federal government owns the reservoir. The Bureau of Reclamation is tasked with running the reservoir, but a different federal agency called the Western Area Power Administration is tasked with running the power generations in there. Sometimes the needs of the reservoir and the needs of the power generation don't match up. And so you have 2 federal agencies fighting against each other. And right below there is a fairly well-known national park, Grand Canyon. And so you have the National Park Service that would like to have some water running through the Grand Canyon. And so occasionally you have those 3 federal entities all squabbling among themselves about what ought to happen, with the 7 states standing on the background and the 14 Indian tribes standing in there. And sometimes it's a wonder we get anything done in the Colorado River Basin. The drought in Colorado has also affected the Colorado Front Range. There are spots of drought. In fact, the San Luis Valley in Colorado is actually in a worse drought than we are in Western Colorado. But the drought in Western Colorado really also impacts Denver and Colorado Springs and Fort Collins, because as I told you this morning, 80% of the water available in an average year falls on the western slope. By the way, a little statistic I didn't tell you this morning is that 90% of our what's called available snowpack or snow water equivalent, 90% of that is stored above 9,000 feet. So if we didn't have our high mountains and they didn't get a lot of snow, we'd be in deep trouble in Colorado. So when you see that water on the high peaks, that's what we love to see. 80% of the rainfall and snow in an average year falls on the western slope. 80% of the people and industry and other things that need that water are on the eastern slope. And they don't get enough natural precipitation to support anywhere near the population that we have on eastern Colorado. So the solution is that we import about 80% of the water needed by the Front Range from the western slope. And most of that comes from the Colorado River Basin. Well, what does that do? That means that in a water short area, the Colorado River, we are actually exporting water to eastern Colorado, which makes it even more water short over here. You're going to hear a lot of discussion in the next few years about what are we going to do about Lake Powell and Lake Mead, because they're slowly, and not so slowly the past few years, diminishing. And one of those discussions is how much water can we continue to take eastward, because that never comes back to the Colorado River. So when you take it to eastern Colorado and irrigate a farm around Fort Collins, for example, that water's gone to the Colorado River Basin. On the other side, when you take it into the Grand River or the government canal, the Highline Canal, and irrigate farms between here and Loma, about half of that water goes back into the river because the farms don't use it all. And so you can raise the same amount of crops and still have half the water coming back to the river. Now we're going to talk about arguments between Eastern Colorado and Western Colorado over how to allocate the Colorado River. Utah also has some trans-basin diversion. From the Colorado River, about 20%, 27% of the water that's used in Colorado is taken trans-basin out of the Colorado River, mostly to the Wasatch Range. And then also the Bear River, which is in northeastern Utah. There are several trans-basin diversions that take water from the Bear River westward into the Wasatch Range, which is where most people, that's the front range of Utah, is the Wasatch Range. So a drought in this basin, the Colorado River Basin, has major impacts on the ability of water providers in both Colorado and Utah to meet the needs of their customers. And I'm talking both irrigation water providers and domestic water providers. And we need both, and also industrial water. We need it all, don't we? We can't have an economy if we don't have water. We've got to grow some food for people. All that's mixed up in there. And as I mentioned this morning, we still haven't solved the problem of people discovering that Colorado and Utah are wonderful places to live and wanting to move here from other places that are not so wonderful to live. The Colorado Front Range added 1 million residents, just the Front Range added 1 million residents in the last 10 years, in the last census cycle. So up to 2020, 2010 to 2020. That's a growth rate of 3% per year. How long can we sustain that? Don't know. I think there's plenty of land in eastern Colorado to sustain people. If, you know, you can fill everything between Denver and Kansas, and who would care? That's that little aside. But we don't have enough water to sustain that number of people. So what are we going to do? We'll have some solutions in a minute. St. George, Utah, in Washington County, is now the fastest growing city in the fastest growing county in this nation, in America. If you've been to St. George, did you see any water in St. George, Utah? If it wasn't coming out of a tap? No. Their major source of water is way to the east, about 30 miles to the east of St. George, Utah. There are some mountains there and surrounded by national parks, and that's their major source of water. But that source is limited. They also would like to tap the Virgin River, but the Virgin River is essentially dry most years. So they've turned to groundwater. They're now pumping groundwater, but it's not a renewable groundwater supply. So at some point, St. George is going to be out of water. Maybe they'll stop growing, maybe not. Maybe they'll just learn to conserve like Las Vegas is starting to do, and Phoenix. Don't know what's going to happen there. Another interesting thing is that there are 12 golf courses within an hour's drive of St. George, Utah. One of the reasons people like to move there is they like to play golf, and you can pick a different course every day of the week and still have some left over. How much water does a golf course take? It takes a lot of water. Okay. So Washington County is going to bump up against some real issues, and they have petitioned to begin a pipeline out of Lake Powell to bring it back up into St. George. Right now, the Utah state engineer is opposed to that petition for all kinds of environmental reasons. Don't know if they can get that done or not, but if they do, and Lake Powell continues to shrink, that doesn't help them. I mean, they're tapping a limited source of supply there. Clearly, there's not enough need for all the water that's necessary in the Colorado River Basin. How do we equitably divide it up? And that's the topic of this talk, is water equity. So think for a moment about how do we equitably divide this water? Who do we favor and who do we disfavor? Because that's essentially what you're going to do. When you say you can have water, that essentially means somebody else doesn't get water. Think about the prior appropriation system that we talked about this morning. When we say that the senior water rights holder gets the water that they're entitled to, that necessarily means that a junior water rights holder is going to get shut off. That's just the way the system works. Do we favor municipal uses? Who would argue in favor of that? St. George, Utah, Phoenix, Arizona, Los Angeles, California, Denver, Colorado. All of those, and say Salt Lake City, Utah. I don't pick on anybody. all of those municipalities need water. Their economy needs it, their people need it, no doubt about it. So do we favor municipal uses as opposed to ag uses? Do we favor industry? We have to have water to generate products to sell. We have to have jobs, and we don't have jobs if we don't have water. How about farming? Yeah, it's important to have food. The Colorado River Basin, it's in the general, is not the farm belt of the country. That's the Midwest, where they don't have to irrigate, they just wait for it to fall. But the Imperial Valley and the Coachella Valley in Southern California produce about 90% of the fresh vegetables for the entire country because they have a huge long growing season, really favorable climate, and they use Colorado River water. So do we cut the Imperial Valley in half? Do we cut into, what do we do? How about the Native Americans? They have in Colorado and in Utah the senior claims to those water. So who gets to make these decisions about how we're going to allocate the water? Do we let individual states make those decisions? The problem is that the river touches just the Colorado River touches 7 different states. And every state has its own culture and is very jealous of its own needs. The latest round of cutbacks to try to save Lake Powell means that Arizona, next year, 2013, Arizona is going to get 28% less water delivered than it did historically from Lake Mead, the Colorado River. Within Arizona now, they have to decide how we're going to allocate that 72% of water that we're going to get. Who's going to get shut? Who's going to be open? Well, the municipalities are going to say, we want it all. The farmers are going to say, then don't buy any pecans because we won't have any. And that argument's going to happen. Do we trust the federal agencies to do this dividing up? The Bureau of Reclamation, well, sometimes they fight among themselves. And do politics ever get involved in that? All the time? Absolutely, all the time. How about Congress? Should we have some sort of congressional panel that would divide the water up equitably? How does Congress usually do in equity? Yeah, that's kind of my thought too. Who speaks for the plants and animals that also rely on the Colorado River and its tributaries? Who gets the seat at the table to say we have to leave some water in the river for the fish? Now, those of you who live in this valley know that we have 3 endangered fish species that live in the Colorado River right in this valley. And frankly, we've done a really good job of considering them and making them part of the equity plan. But the only reason that we've done that is because we have the Endangered Species Act, which makes it a crime to kill one of those 3 species of fish, even if you do it inadvertently. So if an irrigator accidentally got a humpback chub into their irrigation canal and couldn't get it back into the river in time it died, they just committed a federal crime. That was the stick that it took to get hundreds of millions of federal dollars into this basin to fix some things like some ladders so that the fish could get up and around the dams, and to get water from higher up reservoirs. Green Mountain Reservoir is one where they release water so that the fish have enough water to survive in the low flow times. We've done a good job with those particular fish, but only because they're endangered. There's a whole bunch of other fish that don't get considered. So what are we going to do? Well, one quick answer in this basin is that we're going to have to be better about irrigation. And that means 2 things. We're going to have to be more efficient in our irrigation, less waste of water, which means lining canals, putting in pipelines, using sprinkler systems instead of flood irrigation, which is not very efficient. And we're going to have to irrigate fewer acres. Farmers don't like to hear that, but there's no solution to this problem unless we irrigate fewer acres in the Colorado River Basin. And don't forget that a lot of the water that goes trans-basin, especially into northern Colorado, is used for irrigation. So to the extent we dry up farms in Larimer County, Fort Collins, we're saving water that can go back down the Colorado River. 80 to 90% of the water used in the Colorado River Basin is for irrigated agriculture. Think about that. So if we shut down every golf course, if we shut down every municipality, every industry, we would still save only 10% of the water, or maybe 20%. That doesn't make sense, does it? You have to go where the banks are, and where the banks are is for irrigated agriculture. So I'm advocating that we just dry up all the farms. That'll solve the problem. Does that create problems of its own? It might, yeah. So then we would be talking about food equity and not water equity, right? So we can't do that. We can't dry up all the farms. We can become more efficient. And one of the problems with the prior appropriation system is that there is no incentive for a farmer in that system to become more efficient. In fact, there are disincentives. We didn't talk today, we didn't have time, but there's a concept called abandonment that says if you quit using your water, you can lose it after a period of time. So you become more efficient, you use a little less water, you might lose the ability to divert that water after 10 or 15 or 20 years. So we got to solve that problem in the prior appropriation system. That's a legal problem that can be solved. But we still, the bottom line is that agriculture is where we have to look for more water to keep the Colorado River alive. So we eliminate a bunch of fields. I told you this morning that water rights, once they're decreed, are private property rights. There's something called the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution that says you cannot take someone's personal property without just compensation. So if you take the farmer out of the mix and say you can no longer use your water right, who's going to pay for that? Big issues coming up. What does the United Methodist Church say about water equity? The United Methodist Church and Society has a paper about water. And here's what it says. Water is essential to life, yet 771 million people in the world, 1 in 10, think about that statistic, 1 in 10 people in the world lack access to water. According to a report by the World Economic Forum, the water crisis is the number 5 global risk in terms of impact to society. That was before global warming started happening. And we see what happens when water starts shifting away from the equator and more droughts are happening. Today, over 700 million people lack access to safe drinking water, and 2.5 billion people lack access to proper sanitation. Think about that for a minute. 2.5 billion people don't have a toilet or an outhouse to use, leaving men, women, and especially children vulnerable to deadly disease. Waterways are polluted by industrial and agriculture runoffs, and governments have prioritized the needs of corporations over the safety of their citizens. I would say that in the United States, the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and we've done a pretty good job of cleaning up our waterways and also our airways, the Clean Air Act, since 1972. Not true worldwide. Only the United States has those sorts of statutes in place. Back to the Methodist Church and Society. The church has a unique and important role in proclaiming water as a sacred gift from God and working with communities to ensure safe, affordable water is available to all God's children. As we work to align our own practices with this faithful vision, we continue to advocate for just, sustainable, and community-centered policies. So what's happening around us? Looking at our neighbors to the south, here's an article from the Arizona Republic dated September 11th, 6 days ago. Public water utilities in the Metro Phoenix area disconnected water service to 13,002 households from January through May. 5 months, 13,000 households were disconnected from the Phoenix water system for periods of time ranging from a few hours to days or longer. One report from King's College London estimated that more than 6,000 households in Metro Phoenix live without complete plumbing, meaning they were missing hot and cold running water, indoor shower or bathtub, flushing toilet, or some combination of them. In one of the most affluent places in America, the Phoenix Basin, 6,000 people do not have water equity. Think about that. Moving a little farther away from home than Arizona to one of the least affluent places in America, Mississippi. The problem last month in Mississippi was too much water. The capital city of Jackson had record flooding. The Pearl River runs through the middle of Jackson, Mississippi. It's considered at major flood stage when it reaches 26 feet. On August 28th, it hit 35 feet, 9 feet above major flood stage. If you saw the pictures on CNN or somewhere, the whole downtown area of Jackson was under about 8 feet of water. Streets, buildings, everything else was flooded. And among the buildings damaged were all of the water treatment facilities for the city of Jackson. Everybody in Jackson had to begin using bottled water. The pumps were off. No one in the entire city had water. NPR had a report about that on September 4th. I'm going to read some of this for you. The same day that 600 National Guard members deployed around Jackson, Mississippi to distribute water to tens of thousands of people right after the flood, one steady line of cars flowed instead through a quiet residential neighborhood, as they've been doing for months. The Sykes Park Community Center got a large filter 6 months ago to purify water for local residents to pick up. Think about that for a minute. They didn't trust the city supplied water, so they built their own treatment plant essentially with filters. We just don't do it periodically. We do it every single day, said Jason Page, a youth mentor with the group, who speaks as he directs traffic in and out of the parking lot. The Jackson water has been messed up for a while now. A week after more than 160,000 residents lost their water from the Pearl River flood, it's still not clear when the city's primary water treatment plant, O.B. Curtis, will be back up. But even when that happens, people here say the larger crisis will not be over. Jackson's water has been unreliable and unsafe for decades. Many residents accuse the state government of neglecting the needs of a city that's 82% Black. Surely that wasn't happening. And those tensions, along with Jackson's shrunken tax base, pose a challenge to any lasting solution. When you ask almost anyone here in Jackson why the water's been this bad so long, the answer inevitably turns to politics and race. School desegregation in Jackson led to white flight in the 70s. That transformed Jackson into an overwhelmingly Black city and a largely poor one. The mayor is Black and a Democrat. The governor and most state lawmakers are white and Republican. Fixing the water system would cost more than $1 billion. Fixing the water system would cost more than $1 billion. There's no way that Jackson's tax base could pay for that. But when a city asks for state for money, it usually gets far less than requested, if any. The governor blames the water problems on the city's mismanagement. Of course. The folks in Jackson say those in power have always treated the economically disadvantaged, especially people of color. I don't think they care what happens to them until it affects their homes, their children, their money, they don't pay attention. Carlos Martin of the Brookings Institution says the impact of race and partisan politics on infrastructure is real, and Jackson residents are not alone. But ideally, making infrastructure work should unite people. In many ways, it's a miracle we don't have more Jackson, more Flint, Michigan in this country, he says. That's for the grace of God and infrastructure that ties most communities' infrastructure together. He says, on the whole, around the country, infrastructure ties together communities that are Black and white, rich and poor, creating a shared interest in keeping the systems working properly. But when we don't see these same communities being served by the same physical infrastructure systems, we see more of these cases like Jackson. So what he's saying is that when you have white and Black communities, rich and poor communities, that are relying on the same water source, then the white rich folk have an incentive to keep the water system running because it's going to their house. When you have, in the case of Jackson, a white system and a Black system, the rich white folks have no incentive to keep the poor Black folks in running water. That sound equitable to you? No, not equitable. Jackson is pretty much the definition of water inequity. The United Methodist Church already responded to the Jackson flood. As the people of Jackson, Mississippi continue to experience the impact of flooding and a water system emergency, UMCAR has awarded a solidarity grant of $10,000 to the Mississippi United Methodist Conference to provide potable water. We bought a bunch of bottled water and took it to Jackson, Mississippi. UMCAR did that. So here's an update. As of yesterday, a boil your water order was lifted in Jackson. It had been in place since early July, before the Pearl River flood. Why did that happen all of a sudden? Well, the good news is that FEMA, once the governor declared it to be a disaster area because of the Pearl River flood, FEMA was able to step in. Between FEMA and the Mississippi state government, they worked together day and night to fix the treatment plant. They've pledged, both of them, continue to monitor the situation to keep that plant online. We hope that's going to be true. Here's a fun little statistic. The state of Mississippi gave out nearly 11 million bottles of water in the last 3 weeks since the flood. Think about that. Think the logistics of getting 11 million of anything into a city and around. And when I read that, then my next question was, where did all those plastic bottles go? 11 million, even if you crush them, plastic. That's a different kind of equity than we're not talking about today, right? What about internationally? What about water equity internationally? Israel right now is also in the midst of a drought. Their major source of water is groundwater, non-renewable groundwater. And so they are borrowing against the future by pumping their groundwater dry, and it's really quickly being depleted. The Sea of Galilee is fed by groundwater and also by surface water, but to the extent it's being fed by groundwater, and with the drought that's there, it's actually in danger of drying up. The Sea of Galilee is way, way low. In Egypt, the Aswan Dam was built to prevent flooding, but for something like 4,000 years, flooding of the Nile River was a good thing. They flooded, it irrigated their crops, it provided new fresh topsoil from up above. And so what they've done is they've changed the hydrology of that area. Most people think to the detriment of the people below the dam. We all like hydropower. We could also talk about energy equity, right? And that the fact that a lot of people don't have access to electricity, and look at us, we do. Well, we also could talk about global warming and climate change, and we probably need to go to cleaner sources of electricity generation. And hydropower is the cleanest that there is. No pollution at all, but you have to build a dam. And so the Aswan Dam, big hydropower dam, the largest hydropower dam in the world is in China on the Yangtze River. And when they built that dam, and they have a huge, I think 26 generators running right now on the it's called the Gorge Dam. When they built that, they displaced 1.4 million people in 1,000 different towns and villages. What's that? There's a trade-off there. We could talk about land equity, maybe. I don't know. The point is that every time you make a decision, there are lots of ramifications to that decision. So we have a lot of decisions to make in our society in the next few years. Carrie Abelo from Penn State University is an economist, and she has several theories, but what she's entitled The 7 Deadly Water Sins. And here's why she says we have water shortages. The first is that we're changing the climate. We all know that. What that does is it makes dry areas drier and precipitation more variable and extreme. There's something called the Hadley cell expansion that they've been studying for about 50 years. And what it says is that as the earth heats up, clouds are moving away from the equator toward the poles, moving from hotter regions to colder regions. Makes sense? And that means the equatorial regions like sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Central America are getting less rain that they historically have gotten. And more water is falling actually in the temperate zones like North America and lower South America. Her second observation is that more people plus more money equals more water demand. As populations increase and incomes grow, so does water demand. The world population is about 7.5 billion today. It's projected to add another 2.5 billion by 2050. We're going to hit close to 10 billion people in about 30 years. How can the planet satisfy the thirst of those 10 billion people? Growing incomes also exacerbate the water problem because of water-intensive products like meat and energy from fossil fuels that richer populations demand. So a village in Africa that might have gotten used to getting by on maybe 5 gallons per person per day, that's pretty minimal. If you drill a well in that village and now they have access to water that they didn't have access to before, what you'll see is that their use will go up because now they'll want something that they didn't have available to them before, a shower or a flush toilet or something else. I'm not saying that's inequitable. I'm saying it's going to lead to more water demand. Third, groundwater is being depleted. As I talked about in Israel, they're going to bump up against a reality pretty quickly that they're going to run out of groundwater. In parts of eastern Colorado, western Kansas, they've already run out of groundwater. They were depleting the Ogallala aquifer to farm with it. All those farms are now back to dryland farming because they've pumped out the Ogallala. It's not available. About 30% of Earth's fresh water lies deep underground in aquifers. If it's extracted daily for farming, drinking, and industrial processes, it may be unsustainable. India guzzles more groundwater than any other country. 54% of their groundwater wells are decreasing, meaning that they're not being replenished. In 20 years, 60% of India's aquifers will be in critical condition. And how many people live in India? A couple billion, right? Unlike an incoming hurricane or a drained lake, the naked eye cannot see when groundwater reserves in aquifers are declining. Global water supplies are horribly susceptible to this hidden and growing threat. Point number 4, water infrastructure is in a dismal state of disrepair. Water needs to be transported, treated, and discharged. Around the world, water infrastructure, treatment plants, pipes, and sewer systems are in a state of disrepair. That was Flint, Michigan. They had infrastructure, they had a good source of water, they live in the Midwest, lots of water to go around. When their treatment plant failed, instead of rebuilding the treatment plant, they went to a different source of water. They went to the Great Lakes. The chemistry of the water in the Great Lakes was different from the chemistry of the water they'd been using, and that triggered flushing of lead in the lead pipes, both the delivery pipes and the small pipes going into houses, which then allowed the lead to form and get into the system, and you don't want to drink lead. That's what happened there. It was an infrastructure problem. In the United States, 6 billion gallons of treated water are lost per day from leaky pipes alone, 6 billion gallons. Now, that's not completely lost to the system, because if it leaks out of a pipe, where's it going to go? It's going into an aquifer somewhere, and so it's coming back to the system. But it's treated water, so somebody paid money to have that water treated, transported, put in pipes, and it was just wasted. Building infrastructure is notoriously expensive to install and repair, meaning that many localities ignore growing infrastructure issues until disaster strikes. That's human nature, right? How many of you have put off fixing a leaky toilet? We'll do it tomorrow, right? That toilet's leaking, and then tomorrow comes, and then next week comes, and 2 years from now, maybe we'll get that leaky toilet fixed. Same thing with municipalities or anything else. We know that we have leaky pipes. It costs a lot of money. Maybe we'd rather resurface a road, or build a softball field, or whatever, all those other things that societies want to have, instead of fixing our water infrastructure. That particular issue is not just for water, that's for all utilities. California is finding out now that they don't have a very good electric grid. Texas found out a couple of years ago when they had the huge freeze, their electric grid is horrible. Next point is natural infrastructure is being ignored. Healthy ecosystems like forests, like cottonwood trees, are natural infrastructure and vital to clean, plentiful water. They filter pollutants, buffer against floods and storms, and regulate water supply. Plants and trees are essential for replenishing groundwater. Without them, rainfall will slide across dry land instead of seeping into the soil and getting into the aquifer. Loss of vegetation from deforestation, overgrazing, and urbanization, and we all know now, natural wildfires, is limiting our natural infrastructure and the benefit that it provides. Forested watersheds around the world are under threat. Watersheds has lost up to 22% of their forests in the last 14 years. Think about that. That's not much time. 14 years, 22% of the natural forests have been gone in watersheds. Do you know where your watershed is? Where your domestic water comes from? Is there any protection for that watershed? Here's a little issue that's happening in our watershed. We live in Delta. Our water comes from the Gunnison River, treated near Montrose and delivered back to Delta. There's a proposal in Gunnison County to add, I don't know how much, several 100,000 acres of additional wilderness area. Sounds like a great idea. Make some national forest into wilderness area. Happens to be in the middle of the watershed that feeds the Gunnison River. One of the outcomes of designating something as wilderness area instead of national forest is that you can no longer go into that area with any kind of motorized equipment. You can't get in there with a truck or with a four-wheeler or a chainsaw. And so if that area needed to be mitigated to prevent a wildfire from happening, you would be mitigating with axe and handsaws. That's not very efficient. And so there's a big pushback in the upper Gunnison Basin to say we don't want this to be designated wilderness, even though we would get lots of benefit from that. If we have an issue with our watershed, that overrides the issue or the benefits of making it a wilderness area. Number 6, water is often wasted. Inefficient practices like flood irrigation, I already talked about that, and water-intensive wet cooling at thermal power plants use more water than is really necessary. I think you're going to see a push for farmers in California, Arizona, Colorado to go to sprinkler system irrigation, much more efficient. And the reason it's more efficient is that you can gauge how much water is going on the plant, and you may only need to irrigate enough to get 9 inches. You just have to get the water into the root zone. So for a shallow plant like corn or onions or beans, 9 to 12 inches is all the water you need. When you flood irrigate that field, you're going to saturate it down to 3 or 4 feet. Now that water is going to come back to the system, but it comes back in a different time and a different location. Whereas if you're sprinkling, you're only getting that 9 or 10 or 12 inches that you need on the top. The rest of it stays in the river. So I think you're going to see that coming soon. About 80% of the world's wastewater is just discharged back into nature without treatment. Think about that. Not happening in America because we have the Clean Water Act. So if you're discharging wastewater into a stream, you have to have cleaned it up. But in most parts of the world, they simply use it and put it back into the river. What does that do to the next person down the river? You want to live up in the hills if you're living in India. In many countries, it's cheaper to receive clean drinking water than to treat and dispose of wastewater, which encourages water waste. This brings us to the final issue. Her 7th is the price is wrong. Globally, water is seriously undervalued. Its price does not reflect the true total cost of service. So I told you this lady was an economist, Carrie Abelo. She finally came to her area of expertise. The price of water does not reflect the true total cost of service from its transport via infrastructure to its treatment and disposal. This has led to a misallocation of water and a lack of investments in infrastructure and new technologies that use water more efficiently. After all, that just makes total sense. Why would a company or government invest in expensive water-saving technologies when water is cheaper than the technology in question? That's a cost-benefit analysis, right? Water cheap, you go get it. Instead of building a pipeline, let's just go get more water. When the price of receiving clean water is closer to its actual service cost, efficient water use will be incentivized. Then you would build the treatment plant or the pipeline that you would need to use instead of just getting more water. And on the flip side, and here we're talking about water equity, the poor often end up paying disproportionately high prices for water, stunting development. Disproportionately meaning, even though they're paying the same rate as everybody else, based compared to their cost of living and their ability to pay, water may be one of the major expenses, whereas for everybody in this room, your water bill is a minor part of your expense. For some people, it's not. It's a major expense and they can't live without it. Water utilities constantly struggle with the dilemma of providing cheap water but staying in business. This is from Arizona State University paper in 2021 from the Kyle Center for Water Policy. Water equity is a wicked problem. I like that phraseology. Water equity is a wicked problem in that it most often involves complex trade-offs rather than win-win solutions. The extremes are easy to argue. On one side, water is a human right and should be free, no qualifications. On the other, there is no free money tree. Utilities must maintain sufficient revenues to operate, and those who benefit from the community water system should fund it with their benefit, no qualifications. Solutions that keep the water utility functioning adequately for everybody in the community while protecting the most vulnerable, there's our water equity, right, are likely to be found in the middle. Each community water system has its own unique demographics and challenges, like its own source of water, and each community must strike its own balance. Acknowledging the complicated trade-offs associated with water equity and discussing them openly in the community is a good place to start. What kind of discussion might we be talking about if we're going to be discussing water equity in a public forum? Well, one example would be if your local water provider decided to impose a conservation rate structure. This is a very topical idea that has come around, that if we're going to try to conserve water, good idea, got to conserve water, maybe we should conserve water by penalizing people that use too much water. And so we'll have a tiered rate structure. It's so much for the first 5,000 gallons, and then a little more for the next 5,000, and then a lot more for the next 10,000, and then an exorbitant price for anything over 20,000 gallons. Pick a number. The idea being that if people figure out from their water bill that if they just cut back half their use, they're going to cut their bill 3/4, maybe they'll do that. It's sort of an economic incentive to conserve. Well, I think it's a good idea. A lot of entities, a lot of water providers are beginning to talk about that, and it encourages conservation, which is always good. Most of those rates have a base amount. So you get 5,000 gallons for $3 a gallon, $3 a thousand gallons. And they also have some graduated rates. But what amount should be allowed before the conservation rate kicks in? 3,000 gallons, 5,000 gallons? Do we take into account how big your lot size is? Do we take into account how many people are living in your house? Should we allow 1,000 gallons per resident and you get to send in a census that says I have 7 people, so we get 7,000? I'm living by myself, I can live on, I don't know that. Those are the issues that I'm kicking out that we need to think about. And then from a water equity system, what is a fair rate to pay for this basic resource? In some fashion, you would say you shouldn't have to pay for your water. It should be delivered like the air, but somebody has to bring it to your tap, and that costs money. So what's a fair rate for that? We can all pay attention to this conversation, and if it's coming up in your community, where whoever your water provider is, if they're talking about conservation rate structure, you can pay attention to that, and then you can weigh into the conversation about what you think a fair base amount is and a fair rate for that base amount, and probably a fair rate for all the conservation rates too. What else can we do to promote water equity? Well, the United Methodist Church and Society paper that I already read from suggests 3 things. The first is learn about your watershed and your upstream and downstream neighbors. Where does your water come from? Most people don't know. Where does the water go when I flush it down my toilet? Most people don't know that either. Explore how your actions and the actions of your faith community are connected to creation and the accessibility and quality of water for others. we belong to Delta United Methodist Church. We have had a small patch of grass outside of our church from time immemorial. And we've had potted plants, not pot. That's a different church. We've had flowers. That's the word I'm looking for. We've had flowers in pots, several of them around the outside of the church. We used to call them the Green Committee. What are we calling them now, Carol? The caretaker of God's creation committee within our church decided that we could do better than water-intensive flowers that are beautiful, but have to be watered 2 or 3 times a week. So we intentionally still have the pots, we still have flowers, but they planted native shrubs and grasses that if they get watered once a week, they're very happy. And so we're using a lot less water, not a lot, we're using some less water. Probably our next step is to take out the little patch of green grass that's in front of the church. Not very big, but it doesn't serve any purpose other than look pretty. We're not going to take out the patch of green grass in the back of the church because that's a children's playground. And that's the difference between essential grass and non-essential grass. And in Denver right now, they're ripping out lots and lots of non-essential grass, like in medians between major highways. That grass is just there to look good. Gravel or dirt or something else will look just as good. So that's coming in the future. Second thing, be mindful of how much water you use. Look for ways to conserve water, limit waste, and reduce or eliminate runoff and pollution. That's a double-edged sword there. When you take your sprinkler water and let it irrigate, especially your driveway or your sidewalk, that water runs down into the gutter. That gutter runs into a storm drain somewhere and ends up back in the river. And guess what's in that water as it goes down that storm drain? Everything that you had in your car that had leaked out on your driveway the night before, oil and antifreeze and everything else. So that's a double whammy. Not only are you wasting that water, but you're adding dirty water to the clean water in the system. So watch how you use your water. We've always heard, probably from the time you're in 3rd grade, that you should shut the water off when you brush your teeth, right? Forget that. Forget that. It doesn't matter. In the grand scheme of things, that couple of quarts that you're going to save by doing that, now I'm being a little facetious because there's no reason to leave it running. But don't feel guilty if you forget and leave the water running. And the reason is that water that you're putting into your system, into your plumbing system, goes into the sewer, most of us. I'm going to have to give you 2 examples. One of is if you live on a central sewer system, like major city, where there's a water treatment plant at the end of the system. That system is only 5% water consumptive. 95% of the water that city puts into its system goes back to the river. So in the grand scheme of things, your couple of quarts that you might have saved by shutting off that tap didn't do very much, okay? That's why we're having to look at farmers. If you're in a septic system and a leach field, you're doing about 15% consumptive, because the way a septic system works is that it grows the grass over it and that grass evaporates some water. But still, it's a small amount of water. So don't feel guilty if you forget to turn the water off. Don't feel guilty if you take a 10-minute shower instead of a 3-minute shower. Where's that water going for the extra 7 minutes? Going right back to the river somewhere. So on the grand scheme of things, that's not what we're talking about. Do not irrigate your sidewalk or your driveway. That's a lot of water and it's accomplishing nothing. Third thing from the United Methodist Church and Society. Advocate for water as a basic human right. That's what we're about today, isn't it? Water equity. Advocate for water as a basic human right. Support clean water infrastructure and stand in solidarity with and take action alongside communities where water is at risk. Carrie Abelo, the economist who wrote The 7 Deadly Sins, does have some good news for us. She says it's not too late. Amongst these 7 deadly sins, there is good news. Governments, businesses, universities, and citizens around the world are waking up to water challenges and beginning to take action. Each year brings more solutions, like using wastewater for energy. Some places have just been running their wastewater through pipes Takes a lot of energy to do that. Now they're starting to hook up generators to those wastewater pipes and reusing that electricity or that energy to make electricity. Makes all the sense in the world. Using restoration to bring water back to dry topographies. So where we used to just, if a field went fallow, we just let it go. Now we're starting to replant trees and natural vegetation so that we can restore that. And monitoring groundwater levels more closely. We're going to have to do that. We're going to run out of groundwater and we need to know how to solve that problem. Even the best solutions will not implement themselves. Along with fresh water, political will and public pressure are critical resources in ensuring a sustainable future for all. There's been about an article a day in the publications I read from the water world about some city somewhere in the West that's now decided to pay people to tear out their lawns, or it's getting rid of their non-essential grass like in medians. This is a really good start. So as an initial step, conserve your own water. So here's my final suggestion for how you can help with this problem and help to provide water equity around the world. And that is, of course, donation of money, individually or as a group. I have two suggestions for you. UMCOR is a good place to donate. They respond to emergency situations, but they don't do long-term planning. They don't invest in long-term infrastructure, do they, Carol, in some places? So UMCOR is a really good place to put your money. The other place is this water.org that we just saw. I've checked it out. It's been around for about 30 years. It's an international nonprofit organization, and it is given a 4-star rating by Charity Navigator, which is a charity watchdog group. So I feel comfortable that it's not a flash in the pan. It's not going to be a waste of money. They publish how much of each dollar goes to their administrative, which is a very small amount. So 2 potentials for you if you choose to take on some campaign to fund some water equity. If you're really interested in this topic, there's a hour-long webinar, which I didn't think you'd want to watch today, but if you're interested, it's on Arizona State University. It's called 10 Tenets, T-E-N-E-T-S, 10 Tenets of Water Equity, May 10th, 2021. They really got in, there's a panel discussion about water equity. I'm done unless you have questions. Yes, ma'am. Okay. No, I'm sorry, no statements, only questions. Start again.
About 33 years ago, my daughter moved to San Francisco, and the mantra in San Francisco was, if it's yellow, be mellow. If it's brown, flush it down.
Yes.
And they did that because they were short.
So let me tell you what that does. And that's similar to not letting the faucet run when you brush your teeth. That's an important, what that will save is the dollars and effort that it took to treat that water. That water is going to go back to the system as soon as it got flushed anyway. But it took a lot of money to get that water into that toilet. And so it saved all of that money that it took to get those 2 or 3 gallons per flush. Now we have 1.2 gallons per flush or something, but at that time, probably 3 gallons. That took money. So you saved that much money. And it also saved the water at the headwater source. So that any kind of conservation you can do like that's not a bad thing. Other questions or comments?
At the beginning of this session, you quoted those figures from Phoenix about the number of people who had water turned off.
Right.
How would we go about getting that kind of data for our local area, for our water provider?
Mm-hmm.
And to find out if we've got problem spots in our community, because that's where I feel like I could have some impact, is if there are areas in my area.
The question is, how do you access that data wherever you live? Most water providers are public entities, they're cities or they're a water district or water conservancy district, something like that. They're all required to keep those public records and to make them available. So it'd be as simple as an email saying, can you tell me how many people you shut off last year? Probably would be on an annual basis, but on an annual basis, they can do that. You could also ask them what the average length of shut off was. And I think what you'll find is the average length of shut off is something like 1 day, because people forget to pay their water bill. They come up cash short on the day that it's due. And then the day later, they realize, oh, I forgot to pay. So that's our experience. I represent a water provider. And there are people who are chronically late, even though they have the money, they simply refuse to pay. So there's some equity considerations there also. Here's one of the issues about that. And water providers wrestle with this all the time. There has to be some penalty for not paying your water bill, or everybody just gets free water, and there is no free water. Somebody has to pay for the treatment and distribution. Is it better to have a short fuse and give people only like a 2-week grace period, for example, at which time they might have the money to come up with it? Or is it better to give them 6 months to pay, in which time they've used the water, but now they're in debt way more than they can handle? That's an equitable question that you have to struggle with. And of course, every culture is a little bit different. There are lots of places where they will have an emergency supply fund where they will set aside some funds. Maybe 3 cents of every bill that comes in goes into an emergency fund. So people who can't pay their water bill can apply to that emergency fund and have their bill paid out of that. That's a pretty equitable way to solve the problem. Somebody comes in and says, I lost my job, I'm destitute, I'm on the street, whatever, they have an emergency fund. That's something you could actually push for in your local community water provider. Let's provide an emergency fund for the poor people in our community so they don't get shut off. We'll just pull from that emergency fund. And I'm willing to put in 3 cents a month or something. It doesn't take long to build up a big fund when you're servicing 15,000 people a day. So that's a possibility. Other questions or comments?
So I want to know what the feasibility is. I mean, private companies spend thousands and millions of dollars piping oil from the, clear up on the north of Alaska down to Texas. Mm-hmm. Why can't we pipe, like when you're talking about the flood in Jackson, Mississippi, why can't we somehow collect that flood water and send it west? Mm-hmm. I realize it's going uphill, obviously, but all of those areas that we know are prone to flooding, the feasibility of piping that water to areas that need water, especially for agricultural purposes.
It's very feasible. It's not cost effective at all for agricultural purposes. It is cost effective for municipal purposes. And the reason it hasn't been done yet is just the cost of it. At some point, the cost benefit is going to shift, and it probably will be done. It won't be the flood water that we've been talking about, though. It'll be the natural flow of the Missouri River. Missouri River starts in Montana, Yellowstone, goes east, goes down through Nebraska, and intersects with the Mississippi, I think in Missouri. It's called the Missouri River. Not too far from there to eastern Colorado. And so there's a lot of thought that if we had a big pipeline going from the Missouri River back westward and dump that water into somewhere in eastern Colorado, we don't have to bring it all the way over here. Because if we had it available to those water providers in eastern Colorado that are trans-basin diverting water, they can use that water and leave western Colorado water alone to stay in the Colorado River. The engineering of that is easy. They know how to do it. They have several routes that they have several places they could tap. The easiest is to do it right along I-80. It's already a public right of way. You don't have to go acquire a bunch of farmland to do it. You just simply put a pipeline in right along I-80. You have to have several pump stations because we're going uphill a couple thousand feet. But we do that all the time. We pump water uphill all the time. There's a famous saying, by the way, that says, water flows uphill toward money. So when the money in Denver, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins gets enough that it will start attracting that water, that probably will happen. That's a several decades project, of course, but it probably will happen someday. It's just a matter of economics. And one step farther, Southern California has an incentive to throw money at that project. Because if they can throw money at that and get water from the Missouri River into eastern Colorado, they could send more water down to Southern California and Arizona and solve their water problem. So that probably will happen.
So what is the feasibility of desalinization for California? I mean, if our ocean waters are rising, why are we, I mean, other countries have used desalinization. I mean, why isn't California getting into that?
They are. San Diego gets about 30% of its water from a desalination plant that's off the coast in the Pacific Ocean. The problem again is there's two problems with it. One is economics. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of energy to desalinate. And in today's world, you know, where's that energy going to come from? So there's an energy water nexus always. Takes more energy to desalinate. And then the second issue is you desalinate it, you have a sludge that's left over. How do you dispose of that sludge? You don't want to just dump it on the ground. It'll destroy whatever ground it's on. And if you dump it back into the ocean, you create a dead zone around that discharge pipe. That's been the issue, is that how do you do it environmentally consciously, and the cost of it. Once again, as they run out of water, water becomes more valuable. Desalinization looks more promising. We have a desalinization plant at Yuma, Arizona, that we spent several $100 million building. We being the United States of America. Bureau of Reclamation built this desalinization plant at the border with Mexico, because we have a treaty with Mexico that requires us to provide them with 1.5 million acre feet of water every year. We meet that, but it also has a water quality standard. And we've not been very good about meeting the water quality standard on the water we deliver to Mexico. And so we built this desalination plant at Yuma, Arizona, thinking maybe we could clean that water up before we send it across the border and try to meet our obligation under the international treaty. And we've only run that plant about 2 weeks because of the cost of it. And also the environmental impact of when you desalinate it, what do you do with that stuff? So I've always thought that we could dump that between here and Delta and nobody would know the difference. But that's just personal opinion. Questions or comments? Okay, I'm done. Yeah.